Welcome to Recogs, the show where we learn how the world's best business operators build consumer brands from sourcing to selling. Brought to you by Manufactured. Manufactured is an online platform that helps brands manufacture, finance, and distribute inventory across 20 industries and 25 countries. If you're interested in learning more, check out manufactured.com. Our guest today is Brian Gannon, who is the founder and CEO of Loop. Loop is a private family network and home display that helps families stay connected. We get into the weeds about how he found the right manufacturer for Loop and his whole production process, how he also thought about financing growth, whether it be equity or debt, and also prepping for Black Friday and the holiday season from an inventory perspective. Without further ado, here's Brian. Brian, thank you so much for joining me here today. How are you?
Doing great, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate you taking the time. So talk to me from like the very beginning. What was kind of like the aha moment that led you to found Loop?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Boston, but I live in San Francisco now. And when I had kids, I decided I, suddenly wanted to really, keep them connected to my life and the kids' lives for their grandparents and brothers, sister, nephew, and aunt. And I just didn't want to post pictures of my kids on Facebook. It was as simple as that. It started with a problem, of course. And I started, talking with other people, doing some research, and people were saying the same thing, like, "Oh, wow, there's a lot of people that are getting into the privacy movement." And I was like, "Great, I'll make this app," right? And people were like, "Great, built an app," and everyone's like, "Forget about it. I'm still gonna text message my family or something like that." And until we really came up with this idea for a digital frame that solved all the other problems, like connecting in elderly grandparents, being able to see all those pictures, that's really the sort of when things clicked. But the founding of the company and the problem was just me and my kids.
It seems like quite a complex business in some ways because you have like the physical digital photo frame, and then as well as you have, a private social media network. How did you go how did you go and think about, and of course, inventory based businesses, it's really freaking hard, right? Especially ones that as well as there's like a software component, right? That Loop there is. So how did you go about creating like your first prototype and it kind of had to marry these two different models?
Yeah. So, on one hand, it was, I'm happy that we started out kind of as a software company because we had taken a chunk out of. So I think when people say hardware is hard, oftentimes I think what they're really saying in my world is making a connected piece of hardware and the whole shebang work. That's hard. A CPG company might be a little bit less sophisticated in terms of all the different problems, right? They have inventory and all that, but maintaining an app and all that stuff. So in one hand, we kind of were like, great, I've got something foundational here. And we kind of lucked into this hardware thing. And, interestingly, I'll kind of talk about maybe some of the mistakes I made leading into it. When we started, we were saying, whoa, this is pretty interesting. Like that digital frame business, didn't that used to suck? What an interesting entry point, right? Of like, hey, I'm familiar, but they weren't great, like that kind of seemed interesting. And I was like, oh, this will be so easy, right? Like, we're so smart, this will be so easy. I was a chip designer. I had been to China 100 times. Like, I felt like I had it. And then we kind of pulled maybe like a Johnny Ives moment for a minute, like a Steve Jobs thing. And we're like, this thing needs to be so lusciously beautiful and painted on the inside. And it was metal knob. And so we built this product that was not a digital frame, right? And that was intentional. Like, no, this is like a content viewer for your family's memories. And, it's going to stream video and it's going to have all this other wacky features. And when you get the early adopters stirred up, you get a lot of feedback. And look, we did like $1 million in sales, and frankly, the Apple designers use our product. Like, there's a lot of these like interesting ego stroking things, but the reality was we had actually missed our mark. Meaning, yeah, I could sell it in Silicon Valley. Yeah, I could sell it to famous designers and photographers and artists and all this crew because we were trying to impress them with an Apple-esque product. But the reality was we were trying to just solve the normal, American family's problem, right? Of staying connected and sharing pictures in a super easy way. for not a huge and expensive cost either. So we did ship the first one, shipped $1 million worth of it, but really didn't start to scale until we kind of fixed that and made something that was, truly much more of a digital picture frame.
How did you actually create, like, walk me through like a little bit of the process of like creating like your first prototype?
For people that are kind of new to it, the first step, and I might jump back and forth here as I kind of go back to yesteryear, but when you really think about the hardware component, generally speaking, what you're trying to do is to create two models. One would be a works like model, and one would be a looks like model. And the reason you separate them is because it's too hard to make one that does both. It'll take you 10 times more time. So you make the looks like model like, oh, see this is really what it's all going to look like. And you can show investors, you can show retailers, and it's not expected to work. That's the promise. And you can make it perfect, right? Then you have the works like model, and that's something that's just going to be wires, PCBs, and ugly things that gets across some of the basic functionality and serves as usually a platform for doing that. And then it gets even more detailed of products like ours, where there's like 2 or 3 places in the world that you can get something made so incredibly precise and beautiful that you kind of have to know 5 people, and you're like, oh, there's a place in models. I'll just tell you, it's like Model Solution, and there's just these. Once you are in the business a little while, you find these just gem of places that can create these incredibly accurate models for you.
So I guess how did you go about maybe finding, was the same company that was doing the prototyping, was that eventually became like your manufacturer that actually you could scale with?
No, no. So actually, the first thing that helped me get off the so one, I had some experience in making connected hardware, right? Like so, you know, chips, PCB, firmware, and a little bit on the application, and I had experience in manufacturers in China, not a ton, but enough to be dangerous. But then I got into an accelerator called Highway One, and it's in San Francisco. Somehow we found out about it, and it was basically a place that they would say, "Hey, you got an idea, but you probably don't have all the tools to do it." And as I go back, I realize, yeah, there's so many different pieces of the puzzle, and really what they did is kind of helped you navigate this idea. Like I didn't know what a works like model looks like. I walk in there and they say, "Hey, what you're going to get to in the next, here's about 20 grand, right? So there's a little bit of money to use. You're going to need to create in the next 12 weeks a works like model and a looks like model. We'll help you. There's some engineering here, there's some advice." And so that helped, that really, and then they explained to us the process of partnering with a manufacturer, and they could potentially give you some contacts. And so that really obviously was a huge, again, I thought I knew more than I did, and I realized there was a lot more to it.
I really appreciate that. Can we go a little bit in terms of like what you actually look for in like the right manufacturer, how you kind of vetted the manufacturer itself and kind of landed on the one that that actually build Loop?
Yeah, 100%. And we made mistakes, right? So I'll talk about the first thing we did. So the first thing we did is we hired a company and a firm that does this for a living in a way. They find you, so you get to pay them a chunk of money, very expensive. They scour China and these other places to build it. They kind of become your operations team. And the problem with it was that they treated it like this formula that you could go through a spreadsheet and figure out, like, oh, this needs to be medical grade plus this, what type of suppliers. And in the end, they found us a really suboptimal, in the end, we realized was a suboptimal supplier. Like they just didn't have our skill set. And so the product took longer to make with them because they hadn't done something like this, is really what I was trying to get at. They they checked other boxes, right? But not all the right boxes. And so what we learned is it's a little bit more of a common sense approach. And actually, in the middle of this whole thing, this is kind of a funny Silicon Valley thing. Are you familiar with Dropcam? Do you remember Dropcam that got bought by? It was the precursor. Basically, they got bought. It's a home camera that streams to your phone, right? So they were bought by Google and they became Nest. So essentially, They were the first, probably a credible company that got bought by Google for like a half billion. They made the first connected camera to a smartphone, right? Stream what's going on, security camera made easy. Anyways, the founder of that was one of my advisors, and he then hooked me up with Dropcam's entire operations team. Um, and that was actually quite helpful. It was like calling in a SWAT team to get shit done, but it actually was overkill to some extent. And then I'll kind of take you to the present day. And what I found, and this is sort of the advice for folks, and it was given to me as well, was you're trying to find somebody that's already done something really close to what you're doing, right? And I know that sounds obvious, but sometimes people find people that want to get into your industry, and you would be the first. So they're very eager, right? And you're like, great, they're going to cut me a deal. They're really into this. That's kind of what we did. We found somebody earlier, but their capabilities are not great. And what happens is if you don't start shipping a lot of units, you're usually late to market and you burn them out, right? Whereas if you find somebody that does something similar to you, and you might say, well, shoot, what about my IP and all that? Reality is that, many businesses, it's not about the IP of your hardware, it's the IP of your software or your brand or all these other things, right? So you're trying to find somebody that both really is interested in you and the intersection of they've done something damn close to this, ship millions of units, and it's really a twist on what they're already doing. And that, by the way, just to be blunt, sometimes can be accomplished through research through Alibaba.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that that is like part of the challenge too, right? Because when you're starting out, right, like you're obviously, in the early stages. It's not like you can do a massive order quantity. So it's also how do you make sure that you're like being taken seriously, right, by them, and that you're actually serious about this product, but at the same time also kind of understanding that listen, if this goes well, right, this is going to become we're going to become a massive customer of yours. But in the beginning days, it's very tricky, right?
Yeah, and exactly. And so you're trying to balance selling the dream without completely, like, the further away the dream is that you've promised is better because it gives you more time to start catching up. Hey, next year we're going to do 100,000 units, like year one. Gosh, if they're banking on you because of that promise, they're going to be disappointed. If you can somehow create that idea that there is going to be this, look, and again, you're walking into this Chinese factory or Zooming with them and telling them all these incredible things about your company, and it's going to be so huge, and you know, that's great. But on the flip side, you want to make sure that they're okay doing small batches at the beginning. Like as part of my second factory, and the sort of due diligence I had on them was, hey, are you able to do small batches at the beginning? Can you do 1,000, 1,500 units for the first several batches so that we can make sure we're de-risking it, start to get our systems up and running? And if they said 5,000 units, 10,000 units, minimum order quantity, that would have been really challenging for us. It just would have been way too much capital too soon, and you're taking so much risk because if you make a mistake, I mean, you both have a problem. It's not like they're just going to refund everything. And so that, by the way, that also comes down to if they've already got a supply chain up and running, making something very similar to what you're making, the idea for them to flick off and just kind of like not turn their whole factory upside down and their engineering teams upside down to accomplish your project, it's an easier lift, right? And therefore they can kind of agree to do small batches.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. It's also, how much heavy lifting does it actually take in order to produce a product on their end, and so if they are producing maybe similar products, that's okay because it's just not as much of a heavy lift.
And that's the mistake. And just to kind of tell new founders and that sort of thing, because I've seen this where they're like, oh my God, they've already making. I mean, they could be making a quote unquote competitor or something like that, or something too close. If you have something that is absolutely rock solid IP that you're worried about leaking and it's in hardware, it's just so unusual that that's the case. And then you got to be a little careful. But many times, and it's just the same feeling I had was like, hey man, I just really want to make sure that these folks are, not talking to these other potential competitors. It's counterintuitive. It's almost like you want that them to have experience, have learned from your competitors, right? Made those mistakes on their dime. And then you ramp up with your twist on the world, whether it's a software twist or a brand twist or some other physical twist.
That's a great, yeah, no, that's a really great piece of advice. I mean, make sure that you have someone that can, produce a product, and at the same time, because at the same time as well, you're also, at this stage at least, you're just starting out too. So it's, so focus on making just a really great product, or a manufacturer, a partner that actually can produce this product at like the level that you're thinking of, and don't really worry so much about maybe like the IP risk early on, because at the same time, like you're also early on. So like down the road, maybe, but like, and in the early days, like let's just like ship a product out there, right?
100%, 100%. You just don't, your IP is probably not as valuable as it really think it is. Um, so yeah, get it to market paramount. Yeah.
So how did you assess like how much you had to order in the first batch, and overall, like when you were producing, how long did it actually take to actually produce, the first frame that was in your mind workable? I know you went through, one different manufacturer, but yeah.
So I'll take it from the first product because obviously the first product doing it, the second are different. The first one probably took us, from first engagement with them about 2 years, right? And maybe not 2 years entirely. Like there was probably a period of time when we were just shipping and testing the units and making sure they were coming out. Maybe not 2 years, at least a year and a half between 2 years, right? And that's just a long we had one factory partner, then we had to get rid of them, we hired another one and kind of restart some things. There's bugs. Um, but yeah, and I think there was two questions. One was, hey, how do you know how many units to do? Well, really, we had asked them, this first factory, what's my minimum that I could do? And they said 5,000 units, right? Now, if you think about that, you're like, all right, if it cost me $100 to make the product, that's $500,000 of capital, right? And 100 can be kind of expensive too. Hopefully, you'd make it cheaper than that. But you start to get this order of magnitude of how much money you'd have to come up with, and then have maybe 30% down. So that's where this comes into play. Of wait a minute, again, advice number one: make sure your product is not expensive, right? Like coming back to the advice of like, hey, um, you know, do what you can to make compromises for your first version so that your gross margin still makes sense, even if you make a couple mistakes. It's a really tough spot to say, hey, no, we're selling the product and we'll figure out the gross margin later. I just want to make sure the use case works and the revenue thing works. You can't get to the revenue if you have no profit oftentimes. Very rarely do you have much capital that you can just force an upside down economics. And that capital up front becomes huge. If it was a $20 cost, rather than forking over 500,000, you're forking over 200,000. The second part about how many units, how long, I think with the question, and then how many units. So, almost 2 years, lots of mistakes. 5,000 units was their minimum order quantity, which was super hard. Even after we shipped the first one, we're like, okay, great, now I got to do another $500,000 of getting, it wasn't upfront, but like we didn't have it's not sold, right? So in some ways we were lucky on the first order because it was a pre-order and we told the customers it's going to be a year before you get this. We probably said 6 months, right? And so we're able to take orders that help to fund that first production run. But then when you go to the second one, right, then we maybe have to buy all that inventory first, then sell it out or somehow finance it. It's a very tricky spot to get into. Yeah, I was going to say, now the second factory we work with, now we knew what to fix. One, give me a quote, and I want this to be your quote that's super accurate. Needs to be half that, right? Okay, great. I've just solved half of the capital. Now, two, I want to make sure I'm only going to partner with somebody that can do a minimum order quantity of 1,000 units, right? I think we settled on 1,500, right? And it was like, great. The unit cost is lower, which means my upfront capital is going to be lower, and the total units are lower, so the total capital is going to be significantly different.
I'd love to kind of dive into, because, inventory based businesses, it's really hard from a cash flow perspective, as you've, alluded to. how did you think about financing, your inventory and also growing? Because of course you have to obviously pay for the inventory to be created, and then once you sell it, then of course you get paid by the customer. So how like there's obviously like a cash flow imbalance. How did you think overall when it came to financing?
I would argue we were really naive at the beginning, thinking that, first of all, when you're jumping out the window, you're just like, oh, this is easy. I'm just going to do $1 million Kickstarter. Like that's how I get the first order, right? That's an and then someone else gives me capital out of equity, and they'll give me another $5 million, and then whatever. This is not complex, and then that is a rational plan, right? But it's almost like a VC backed thinking, right? Versus finding somebody that can sell you in small quantities so that you can fork out much smaller amounts out the door. Hey, $30,000 to start the order, right? Then let me, and hopefully you're building up your sales pipeline. Let's say it's digital ads, getting good at that, starting to sell the product, and then, basically trying to work, using still some equity capital, but at a much smaller, scale. And then brick by brick, 1,000 units. Hey, great, I turned a profit. 2,000 units. Hey, great, I turned a profit. Let's reinvest that, reinvest that. Give you an example. GoPro never raised money, not until they basically went public. So the trick, now this is a trick that they did that I couldn't pull off, and this has a lot to do with selling the dream in small order quantities, right? Which is, hey factory, what terms can I get, right? That'd be one. Can I pay you back 30 days later? Well, if it's $1 million, nobody's going to do it at the beginning. But if you can make a small order and pay it back, and then they increase it every quarter, right? Hey, you paid it back. That's great. We're going to increase the order by 25%. Go over, pay it back. And then what the other thing they did is they use retail deals and factored, right? So this whole financing thing, whether it's manufacturer or whatever, or any financing partner, everyone's going to be trying to get terms from your factory, right? And I think that's the first smartest place to go. Can you just pay them later? But then as you grow and it gets harder, you realize that doesn't last forever, right? You got to get your unit economics right. But then you need someone to help you with capital. There's almost no way around it, really. I haven't heard of anybody like, aside from, in fact, I'll tell you the 10 other things that GoPro had going right for them. They did this slowly over many, 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 many years. They actually did have capital and equity, right? So they had a rich father going along with it and funding a little bit of money at the beginning. They had full retail deals built in, and then they had a YouTube machine that was pumping out content constantly. So it was a very unique sort of viral growth, methodology, with retail who had terms as well. So that's a unique situation. But folks like us, at one point, pretty quickly, we realized, man, you need someone to finance this, and going through venture and equity is probably not the best thing for your company.
The thing about equity too, it's very expensive capital to use on just for inventory, right? So there's a lot of other options, and where you can actually hopefully if you have access to them, access to the debt markets, and actually use debt in order to actually finance that inventory. So that makes sense. How did you also like when you thought about this on the financing side? Like how did you think about even like choosing like the right partners for you?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, you just have to become aware. This is kind of like one of those things of like, hey, how did you find the factory? It's like somehow you have to just ask people, get advisors, start to learn, and the ideas will start to flow, network your way in. And there for us too, if you think about it, it's been a bit of a growth market, and a bit of a visible growth market of companies that are coming up and financing, revenue-based financing. So I think, maybe 10 years ago, there would have been, maybe a little bit longer, it would have been a little bit more like PO financing of like, hey, I've got a deal with Best Buy for this many units. It's real, Best Buy, give me the capital and I'll make it. So it's like factoring and that sort of thing. And that's probably to my knowledge, those were sort of the only things out there. So in the new world of direct to consumer, what do you use? There's no, there's no Best Buy out there with a hard order, and nor do we really want one at the beginning. So this has become a big conundrum. So on one hand, it's better because you can start to build a business slowly and not have to wait for the Best Buy deal to save your bacon. On the flip side, who's going to lend you the money for it? Is it purely equity? And then there's this middle ground where you don't have a track record yet. And so who can lend you that money? So in a perfect world, you would do a Kickstarter, get some sales, have a little bit of a track record, have a machine and some, measurable, customer acquisition costs that you can present. But it's not easy.
I'm kind of curious in terms of how did you end up kind of partnering or also like using ma- manufactured when it came to like the financing side?
Yeah. So actually, it's kind of interesting how all this stuff works. We had a personal connection, right? So to the company, and so and in some ways, this is kind of why I think it's a really, this is that sort of insightful information. Like, look up online, that's great. Of course, do things like that. But I think networking with people can be maybe even more helpful in some ways. I know that, again, this sounds counterintuitive. You should always do your research, Google something, do a search, do a spreadsheet, talk to people. But, what may work better is having a personal relationship with somebody as an entry point, of an introduction. And then you're kind of talking human to human rather than sort of an application based flow. And again, there's other ways of doing it. But I found, remember I was telling you the idea of like the factory partner in a way that you have out there. If you can find a way to build that personal relationship, because you are actually quite connected in both from the factory side and the financing side. These are some of the most strategic, important decisions you're going to make, right? There's a lot of other frivolous, things you could be doing. Who you're using for marketing. You use this firm, use that firm, change this, change that. The factory and your financing partner. I mean, you better have some sort of relationship with them. I don't know if it has to be personal, but there has to be something in there, um, to handle the ups and downs.
Yeah, I mean that makes a ton of sense because I mean they're also going to be the ones, as you say, that are going to be there for handling like the ups and downs when it comes to the ebbs and flows of the business. I mean, we were just talking about how before this too, in retail, e-commerce, retail, inventory based businesses, consumer businesses, there is certainly like an ebbs and flows. I mean, it's almost like in some ways like seasonal, right? Like because a lot of your profits, a lot of like the big moments is kind of like Q4, and as you said, like it's really just like a 3 week period. So it's making sure that you are actually aligned with a partner that kind of understands in terms of okay, from an inventory perspective, maybe in like the summer periods, we need to really load up now and really prime ourselves in order for the big retail season. Even if in the prior months you might not have like that like past performance.
Yeah, totally. And so this is where if you have a relationship, you can have a conversation about that. And what I would do is pull out all the information I had about my business down to the detail, and then say, let's all look at what I had historically and what are some of these opportunities ahead. Because I also want to know from their side, manufacturer and find it, basically what are you seeing out there too? You're getting other data points beyond what I'm doing, right? So you might have someone who's steady state that is kind of losing momentum, and you're like, hey, this is a softer market than you may think. Or hey, things are really taking off, and it's actually quite bullish. You may want to, grab a bit more share. And then there's just the total limit amount, that you need to all agree on. And you may want to push that up or down, press it up a little bit through data-based communication. Hey, really think if we did X, Y, and Z, this should be pretty straightforward. So, um, Yeah, I mean, I think that that's I think it's basically. I mean, I think the challenge is if you have a business that's like steady state or growing by 5 to 10% a year, it's not that complex, right? You kind of all know what I did historically. You add a little buffer to it and you do it again. If you're planning on doubling or tripling each year, the difference between doubling and tripling is a pretty big financing leap, right? Of saying, hey, look, I think I could do three times more than I did. The market's there. Um, and conversely, doing 20% more, it would be, especially for a fast growing company, would not be considered very interesting. More risk to get it right.
I guess my final question for you is, what to you is more valuable, $100 of inventory or $100 cash?
Well, that's a funny question. I have never thought about that. What's interesting is that as your unit economics improve, and you know that you can turn that into, let's call it a bit of a flywheel, like that inventory, like $100 of cash in a way would, and I'm starting from ground zero, we're obviously just using normalized numbers. It then takes so long to get to a piece of inventory, right? Which is the basis of my sales engine. I'm just more close to the revenue, right? If I have to achieving revenue, if I actually have a piece of inventory in there. And I'd have to think about it a little longer, but I think that's kind of how I feel. And to be honest with you, like one of the things that has been extremely helpful with my partnership with manufactured is that we both identified that running out of inventory is really problematic for a business, right? It's not kind of like, hey, I'm missing out on a little bit more sales. You're, for a direct to consumer business, you're really slowing down the momentum. And that means the momentum of your ads and your sales and your marketing machines, right? You go down and then it takes a while to ramp them back up. It's just sort of law of physics in some ways. And so that's again kind of this idea of, hey, look, you want to really sell through a lot, but not everything. And so how much do you build so that you can just keep the machine moving, especially after holiday seasons where you're getting an incredible demand, but it also drops off in Q1.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I would say like how like I think about this question is, if there's demand for your product, $100 of inventory is always kind of worth more than $100 cash, because of course, if let's say your margins are 50%, then that inventory is worth, $200 at the retail value. And so, but at the same time, like, which another founder pointed this out on a previous show, like there's very few products that just sell off the shelf, right? Like there's obviously marketing costs, there's other things that are kind of associated in order to actually sell that product too. So, so that's also, you know what I mean? So like another guest said that he would actually take $85 if he could in inventory, $15 for marketing, and then turn that into, much more cash. So anyway.
Yeah, and that's 100% true, which is you really have to allocate that capital. Like you can't just walk into, which we've kind of been on the other side of that, where we started as some inventory, but we just realized we didn't have the capital to market it properly. And then you could feel it like, oh my gosh, right? I'm sitting on all this inventory, but I don't have the capital to push it and get that. And again, that has a little bit to do with keeping the flywheel going, because you know, that flywheel, as you even on Amazon or with SEO or affiliate deals and all that stuff, if you keep the machine moving, is constantly generating profit, right? Especially on like as we're kind of seeing like partnerships and that integrations where you're not buying ads. You don't actually need marketing capital for that, right? Like, just as an example with Amazon, as you get the machine moving, you got to keep it going with a little bit of ads, but really the organic profit is where the economics work. And then if you have partnerships with folks that are affiliate, essentially, they take a portion of revenue, a revenue share. Again, those are wonderful, and those might even be better than a Best Buy deal, right? Just getting it on a Best Buy store shelves. It sometimes I think is like you've already done your marketing up here. The customer's already been well aware of your product. They kind of want it today. And it's a little less browsing thing, except during the holidays when they're like, shoot, what can I get for my family? Oh, okay, great. buy this quickly.
Right. No, that makes a ton of sense. Brian, this was an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, pleasure for me, Mike. Thanks for having me.
And there you have it. It was a pleasure chatting with Brian. Brian, thanks again for coming on the pod. And also, thank you to Manufactured, who is producing this pod. So, Manufactured is an online platform that helps brands manufacture, finance, and distribute inventory across 25 industries and 25 countries. If you're a brand looking for inventory financing, for example, or need help on the sourcing and manufacturing side, give us a shout at manufactured.com. Thank you.